After the controversial hanging of Mary Surratt, the Middle Military Division became the Middle Military Department, and Hancock had to move his headquarters to Baltimore, Maryland. For the rest of 1865 and into 1866, Hancock performed the duties he had become accustomed to before the war, garrison duty. He allocated troops, helped soothe unrest, and made trips to inspect garrisons. Elmira made the journey to Baltimore and spent that time with her husband, making up for lost time that the war had taken away from them. One piece of business that Hancock took care of while the head of the department was obtaining a pardon from the Attorney General for his friend from California, Joseph Lancaster Brant, who had joined the Confederacy and obtained the rank of Brigadier General. Those high-ranking Confederate officials had to apply individually for pardons, and it was Hancock who lobbied on his friend's behalf. Another friend who made an appearance in Hancock's life was Harry Heath. The Virginian had to travel to Baltimore on business, and Winfield and Elmira insisted that he stay with them. He did, and the two generals from the opposing sides of the conflict conversed with one another as if nothing had happened. They did some playful arguing about the Battle of Reams Station and Hatcher's Run, where they had commanded the two opposing sides and generally had a great time with one another. No war could dismantle their friendship. Before Heath left, Hancock informed him that he owed the ex-Confederate $1,000. Heath, who had lost money while supporting the losing side in the conflict, thought this was a form of charity on Winfield's behalf, but the Pennsylvanian showed Heath in his ledger book that through their various business dealings in the 1850s that he owed him $1,000. After the proof in black and white, Heath accepted the money. As the Union armies dissolved and the regular army emerged once again, Congress reorganized it to contain 54,000 men, a drastic increase from the 16,000 in the regular army before the war. However, there was more need for troops with the occupation of the South and to deal with Native Americans in the West. Therefore, basically two armies came into existence, one to deal with the South and one to deal with the West. William Tecumseh Sherman became the commander for the armies in the West, protecting white settlers who were traveling across the overland routes to the West Coast. Sherman wrote to Grant that he needed a young general who can travel and see with his own eyes, and if need be, command both whites and Indians to keep the peace, and he specifically mentioned Hancock as that commander, adding, "Baltimore is no place for him." Also during this time, Grant got moved to general of the regular army, placing Sherman as lieutenant general, and that left a space open for major general in the regular army. There may have been some discussions, but there was only one choice most people agreed on, that Hancock should have that spot, and that is exactly what happened. In August, Hancock would take command of the military department of the Missouri, so he moved his family west to Fort Leavenworth. In late January of the next year, 1867, Hancock's father was ailing, and the family feared he was close to death, so Winfield obtained permission to go on leave to visit his father in Norristown, Pennsylvania, and arrived before he passed. On February 1st, 1867, Benjamin Franklin Hancock passed away and was buried in Montgomery Cemetery. After the funeral, Hancock consoled his mother and then headed back to Fort Leavenworth for a proposed expedition to Kansas. Fear spread throughout the West that Native Americans were being heavily armed by white merchants and planned on uprising. Sherman and Hancock met at the former's headquarters in St. Louis to discuss the expedition. Sherman stated that he wanted Hancock to organize out of the present command a sufficient force to go among the Cheyennes, Arapahoes, Kiowas, and other similar bands of Indians and notify them that if they want war, they can have it now, but if they decline the offer, then impress on them that they must stop their insolence and threats. Hancock assembled about 1,400 soldiers, elements of the 37th Infantry Regiment, the 7th Cavalry, and an artillery battery. On March 26, the force commanded by Hancock moved out from Fort Riley and headed deeper into Kansas. Colonel Andrew Jackson Smith commanded both the cavalry and the district through which the expedition moved, but while he did the paperwork, the cavalry work was done by his Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Custer and Hancock had known one another since the Peninsula Campaign. On April 7th, the group made it to Fort Larned, a vital fort on the trail to New Mexico, and it was there that Hancock was to meet with some of the principal chiefs of the Southern Cheyennes. A snowstorm delayed the chiefs one day, then a passing buffalo herd, which they determined to hunt, delayed them again. It was the evening of April 12th before two chiefs, Tall Bull and White Horse, along with 10 or 12 braves, made it to Larned for the council. Hancock grew suspicious at the lateness and the meager attendance. "Now I have a great many soldiers," Hancock said, "more than all the tribes put together. I intend not only to visit you here, but my troops will remain among you, to see that the peace and safety of the plains is preserved." Then he said, I have heard that a great many Indians want to fight. Very well, we are here. We came prepared for war. If you are for peace, you know the conditions. If you are for war, look out for its consequences. He emphasized the importance of keeping treaties made with us and letting the white man travel unmolested. I will await the end of this council to see whether you want war or peace. He also informed the two chiefs that he intended to march to their village to talk to more chiefs. Tall Bull replied with a dim outlook on their own situation because of the destruction of the bison and diminished numbers of their tribe. With that, the meeting ended. The next morning, April 13th, Hancock headed up the Pawnee Fork toward the village and camped about 20 miles from Fort Larned. That night, several Cheyenne chiefs and Pawnee Killer met with Hancock and arranged for a council to take place the next morning at 9 o'clock. The next morning came and no one came to meet with the general. At 9:30 a.m., Bull Bear, one of the Cheyenne chiefs, came into camp and informed him that the chiefs were on their way. Hancock did not like this lateness. He was a military man that prized punctuality, and this irked him. So he told Bull Bear that his force would march closer to the village and meet with them that night. The army had only made it a few miles before a large group of about 300 armed Native Americans came into view. They formed up into battle line, and so did Hancock's little army. They got to within a couple hundred yards of one another, and the tension grew. About 12 Indians rode toward the blue troops. Hancock, accompanied by Smith, Custer, and a few others, rode to meet them. Winfield asked if they wanted peace or war. The famous chief Roman Nose stated, "We don't want war. If we did, we would not come so close to your big guns." When Hancock asked why he had not come to Fort Larned, he replied, "My horses are poor, and every man that comes to me tell me a different story about your intentions." Hancock then informed the group that he would march closer to the village and meet with them that night. He did, and at about 5 p.m. several chiefs came to meet with Hancock. They told him that their women and children were scared and had already ran away. Winfield instructed the chiefs to bring the women and children back to the village. The chiefs left, and at 9:30 p.m., word was sent to Hancock that they had decided to flee with the women and children. Angry, Winfield told Custer to go surround the village, but when he made it to the encampment, all the Indians had already gone. All that was left was smoldering fires, empty lodges, and items not able to be carried. Hancock saw this as a disrespectful act, but not helping his case was that this was a peace-seeking mission. He ordered the village to be burned and any goods found to be captured property. Word spread throughout the tribes of the fire on Pawnee Fork, and attacks began to increase against white settlers as an outcome. The army then moved to Fort Dodge, where Hancock met with Kiowa and Arapaho chiefs, having better conversations with them about peace than with the Cheyenne. He urged them to stay south of the Arkansas River in order to stay away from the hostile Cheyenne and Sioux who were now attacking settlers. After leaving Fort Dodge, the group was met by the famed war chief Satanta. The chief assured Hancock that he wanted peace. As a gift, Hancock gave Satanta the overcoat, sash, and hat of a major general. Months later, Winfield was horrified to hear that Satanta led an attack on the herds of Fort Dodge wearing the regalia of a major general. Once Hancock returned to Leavenworth, he dealt with Native American uprisings by allocating troops to what was termed trouble areas, but the biggest problem he had was not with the Plains tribes, but with George Armstrong Custer. Hancock had dispatched the Cavalier across the plains to deal with the hostile Indians, but Custer pushed his men to the breaking point. Forced marches and poor planning led to desertions, and Custer's orders to shoot deserters lowered morale further. Add on to that, a soldier began drinking heavily, presumably from the hard duty, and committed suicide. This was already concerning, but to top it all off, Custer, without orders, leave, or authorization, abandoned his men at Fort Wallace and raced off to Fort Riley to see his wife. Hancock arrested and brought charges against him. Custer was found guilty and sentenced to 1-year suspension from the Army. However, before the verdict was handed down and before the summer ended, on August 26, 1867, Hancock was transferred by order of President Andrew Johnson to command the 5th Military District, encompassing Louisiana and Texas. Louisiana, like many of the southern states, were having trouble adjusting to the abolishment of slavery and civil rights being given to African Americans. To make matters worse for them, they were being occupied militarily by Union troops. New Orleans had been a sore spot thus far during Reconstruction, and it had been commanded by Union generals like Benjamin Butler, Nathaniel Banks, and Philip Sheridan. Through a series of presidential orders and discussions between the President and Ulysses S. Grant, Sheridan and Hancock switched places. Sheridan went to command the Department of the Missouri, and Hancock traveled to New Orleans to oversee command of the 5th Military District encapsulated in Louisiana and Texas. This was a huge transition from the radical Republican-supported Sheridan to the Democratic Hancock. When he received the order, he wrote, "I am expected to exercise extreme military authority over those people. I shall disappoint them. I have not been educated to overthrow the civil authorities in time of peace. I intend to recognize the fact that the Civil War is at an end, and shall issue my order or proclamation accordingly. I tell you this because I may lose my commission, and I shall do so willingly, rather than retain it at the sacrifice of a lifelong principle." Hancock was not going to go along with radical Reconstruction agendas, and this placed him in complete opposition to many of the people he was sent to oversee and members of Congress. He was thrust into the middle of the conflict between Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans. Grant met with Hancock in Washington, D.C. before the latter moved on to New Orleans. After the interview, Grant was suspicious of Hancock and the actions he may take as commander of that district. Grant was right to be weary of Winfield's actions because they did not fit with how the commanding general wanted Reconstruction to proceed. Hancock had been instilled from his youth by his father that local and state governments should exercise their power freely with little to no intrusion by the federal government. It was this mindset that Hancock took with him into Louisiana and Texas, which put him on a collision course with Republicans in the state and in Congress. When he arrived in the Crescent City, he wasted no time in issuing General Orders No. 40 on November 29, 1867, his first day on the job, where he stated that where local civil authorities were ready and able to perform their duties, that the Army would not interfere with those local governments, but that insurrection would be suppressed with a force of arms. This order caused a lot of concern all over the country and allowed white Democrats in Louisiana to breathe a sigh of relief. Republicans knew that without military might, then African Americans would fail to achieve any semblance of civil rights if the local governments had their way, but they also knew that they would be politically ruined without backup from the military, as they had in the past. In response to Hancock's order, some congressmen put forward a bill that would reduce the number of major generals by one, eliminating the junior officer, which was Hancock, but nothing came of the bill. Another action Hancock took was revoking an order put in place by Sheridan, which encouraged freedmen to be jurors and disqualified whites who formerly supported the Confederacy. Hancock argued that since so few African Americans could read or write, choosing them as jurors brought courts to a standstill. This also followed along with his mindset that the military had no right to interfere with civil matters if the civil authorities were prepared to take on those tasks. Without the military enforcing civil rights, local governments banned African Americans from being seated as jurors. A common occurrence in the Reconstruction South was the presence of soldiers at the polls to make sure no harassment or violence was perpetrated on any voter for their political beliefs. Hancock would recall all soldiers from standing guard at the polls, believing that the military had no right to interfere with elections. However, the lack of military led to voter suppression with violence and intimidation used as common tactics against political enemies. In early 1868, Hancock revoked another one of Sheridan's orders, the one preventing ex-Confederates from voting. Sheridan's proclamation had given a lot of political power to the newly freed African Americans, but Hancock's actions would inevitably change that. In February, another controversy would occur. In the election of 1866, Arthur Gastineau had won election as recorder of the 2nd District of New Orleans. However, his defeated opponent took the winner to court because Gastineau was not of the legal age required to hold that position. By February 1868, he had attained that legal age, but the board and assistant board of aldermen met to elect a recorder. Hancock desired the people's choice to be installed and for no election to take place. The aldermen ignored Hancock's order and called for an election anyway. Winfield appointed Gastineau into the vacancy and removed 9 aldermen. 7 of the 9 were black and represented the entire black membership of the board. No African Americans were among the new members that Hancock appointed. Enough public outrage prompted Grant to order Hancock to reinstate the officials. Winfield performed his duty, then sent a letter the same day asking to be relieved of command of that district. On March 16th, he was granted his wish. Hancock returned to Washington from New Orleans and was named commander of the Division of the Atlantic. However, he would become estranged from Grant in light of Winfield's removal from command in Louisiana. While in Washington, D.C., Hancock went to talk with Grant, who was not in his office. Winfield was a little sore at Grant for countermanding his orders while commanding in Louisiana, and Grant did not like the direction Winfield took Reconstruction in that state. That being said, a day or so later, Hancock walked by Grant on the street, who was talking with a former governor of Louisiana, and tipped his hat at the commanding general and passed by. Grant considered this a snub by a subordinate officer. The bad blood between the two began to boil. In 1868, the Republican and Democratic National Conventions met to pick candidates for the presidency. The Republicans chose Ulysses S. Grant. When the Democratic Party met in New York City, over the course of a couple of days, supporters for some of the most famous and notorious politicians upheld their candidate's superiority. At the convention was a band of supporters for General Hancock. He seemed like the best candidate to go up against Grant. The commanding general had saved the Union, produced victories, and was an all-around war hero. If the Democrats put up Hancock, they could nullify the Republican candidate because Winfield was also seen as a war hero. By the 18th ballot, Hancock had taken the lead, but after a recess, with the convention resuming the next morning, Horatio Seymour emerged as the presidential candidate from the state of New York. Hancock was passed over for the vice presidency because geographically, Pennsylvania was connected to New York, and they wanted to cast a wide geographical net. When Grant became commander-in-chief, he rearranged the commanders of the military divisions. He placed Meade back into the Division of the Atlantic, Sheridan went back to Louisiana, and Hancock was sent to the military backwater that was the Department of Dakota. In a disrespectful move, Grant moved Sheridan to the rank of lieutenant general when Sherman got advanced to the rank of general-in-chief after Grant's resignation, rather than put George Meade in that position. When the position of commander of the Division of the Pacific came open after the death of George Thomas, Hancock would ask for but be denied that position in favor of a general his junior, John Schofield. The Division of Dakota was a large expanse, 1,200 miles from east to west with only 1,682 soldiers. There were 2 posts in Minnesota with 155 men, 10 posts in Dakota with 1,121 altogether, and 3 posts in Montana encompassing 406 men total. It was a skeleton army that Hancock was expected to command. The general went on a 6,800-mile tour of the department. On July 2, 1869, he took a steamboat to Fort Stephenson in what is now North Dakota, and met with several chiefs from the surrounding tribes aboard the ship. Because of his past problems and the way he dealt with Native Americans, he took on a new strategy and let his kindly nature govern his actions. The chiefs relayed to Hancock that they were starving and suffering from disease. Winfield did what he could by allocating food and medicine to the tribes. The chiefs later said he was a bright spot in their discussions with the army. One problem that Hancock was having in the department was Fort Buford. It was positioned in Lakota hunting territory and was coming under attack by that nation repeatedly. The army's horses and cattle would be stolen, and it was causing a large headache to the commander. Through the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the army had given up its forts in the Powder River country, and Hancock wanted to make sure that Fort Buford would not come to that same fate. Along with preserving the fort, he set about protecting the surveying parties of the North Pacific Railroad, protecting the mining settlements in Montana, and securing the Indian agencies of the Missouri River. Many Native American groups had moved into Canada, so Hancock got permission to build a fort against the Canadian border with what is now North Dakota. Philip Sheridan desired a winter expedition against the Blackfoot Indians who had attacked miners in Montana. Hancock placed Major Eugene M. Baker in command of this expedition, and over the course of a month, from January 6th to February 6th, 1870, Baker marched 600 miles and had killed 173 Indians, 53 of which were women and children. Word spread throughout the country about what they termed the Baker Massacre. Sherman, Sheridan, and Hancock came to Baker's defense, regretting that women and children were accidentally killed, but insisted that such attacks came with such a possibility. Additionally, around 100 women and children were taken prisoner and then released. One of the largest tasks opposing Hancock was fulfilling the Treaty of Fort Laramie that allowed for the Sioux to keep the Black Hills in the southwest corner of the Dakota Territory. It became the duty of the Army to prevent white encroachment into the area who attempted to capitalize on the gold present there. Hancock spent his years in the department turning back white settlers who wanted to mine in the Black Hills, and he was very effective at his job, gaining some respect from the Sioux for upholding the government's end of the treaty. Another significant moment that occurred while Hancock commanded the department was the expedition of Lieutenant Gustavus C. Doane of the 2nd Cavalry, who explored the upper reaches of the Yellowstone River. He made note of the geysers and deep canyons, and Doane's report was sent to Hancock. Then Hancock, intrigued at the report, sent it to the Adjutant General and recommended it to be published. This partially led to the establishment of Yellowstone National Park in 1872. In November 1872, George Meade passed away, and thus Hancock became the senior Major General. According to custom, he could succeed Meade in his position at the time, which was the Division of the Atlantic. Grant did not have to give Hancock the position. He could have kept him in the Dakota Territory, but as Sherman advised him, it would give Sheridan a subordinate he would like to work with in the form of Alfred Terry. On November 25th, Hancock was named commander of the Division of the Atlantic, so he and his family packed up and began their journey east. While Hancock and his family was in transit to Philadelphia to the headquarters of the Military Division of the Atlantic, William Tecumseh Sherman changed the location of the headquarters to New York City. George Meade had been permitted to keep his headquarters in Philadelphia because it was his hometown, but since the old general had passed away, there was no need to keep it there, so the Hancocks had to change course. Winfield took command of the division on December 16, 1872. The division incorporated New England, the Mid-Atlantic states, and the Great Lakes region. The Great Lakes were commanded from Detroit by Meade's and now Hancock's subordinate, Philip St. George Cooke, the father-in-law of the famed Cavalier Jeb Stuart. The rest of the division fell under the direct supervision of the division commander. Hancock had been adept at Army paperwork since before the war, and this was more of that very same thing, and he was good at it. This monotonous job, although important, produced a lackluster life, as opposed to the thrill of battle experienced in the war. However, the general did get to spend more time with his family. Unfortunately, in March 1875, at the age of 18, Ada, the Hancock's daughter, passed away. Winfield was grieved at this, especially since he had been so close to his daughter in the recent years. In 1876, the presidential election grabbed the attention of Hancock, who had supporters all over the country, putting his name forward as a possible candidate. For countless elections all over the country, Republicans waved what was called the bloody shirt. In short, that meant that they used the fact that they fought to preserve the Union, and the Democratic side supported secession and the destruction of the country as a way to gain votes on the basis of being loyal to the United States. When Civil War veteran Rutherford B. Hayes was put up by the Republicans, the bloody shirt was waved, and the only way for Democrats to get them to put the shirt away was to nominate a Union Civil War veteran as a candidate. Therefore, at the convention, Hancock's name was thrown into the ring, but Samuel Tilden of New York had secured the nomination long before the convention took place. On the second ballot, Tilden was declared the candidate. The election of 1876 was controversial, to put it lightly, but through political maneuverings and manipulation on both sides, Hayes was made president-elect. Calls were made to march on Washington and overthrow the election. Democrats even named Hancock as the man who could do it, but those that put forward that idea did not know Winfield Scott Hancock. The general himself was dedicated to the belief that the military should not interfere in civil life. Indeed, if something of that sort had happened, one can bet that Hancock would have been the one leading the charge against the insurrectionists. However, none of that materialized, and Hancock continued as division commander. Between 1876 and 1877, much of the South and the Gulf came under the command of Hancock, but with Hayes' end in Reconstruction, the job of the Army changed through the eastern half of the country. The nation was embroiled in a hot labor dispute by 1877. The United States experienced a depression in 1873. Most workers were simply happy to keep their job, but 4 years later, as the country was rebounding, the railroad companies had begun a rate war against one another. This led to companies slashing the pay of their workers to keep in competition with other railroads. However, although they cut the pay of workers, they still gave the customary 10% dividends to their stockholders. This infuriated the workers, and in 1877, we see the Great Railway Strike. Much of the focus was on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, where strikebreakers were called in to replace those workers who refused to run the trains. However, in Martinsburg, West Virginia, the situation was a little different. The citizenry was behind the striking railroad workers. The police force was too small to control the protests, and even though they arrested some of the workers, a large crowd extricated them from the jail. Eventually, the large crowd blocked any train from moving, and around 1,200 freight cars were blocking the tracks at Martinsburg. The strike spread from West Virginia to Maryland and then all over the country, but some of the most violent instances occurred in Pennsylvania, especially Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and towns between the two major cities. In Pittsburgh, militia had fired 2 volleys into a crowd and killed many. The angry mob trapped them in a railway yard, and troops only escaped by shooting their way out, losing some of their own. Hancock went to work traveling first to Baltimore and then to Philadelphia, spreading his troops all over the states of Pennsylvania and Maryland. The presence of regular troops quieted the rioters, but there was still underlying tension. Hancock commented that the workers and their families were in bad situations and half-starved. However, for the moment, the strikes had been taken care of. The next crisis emerged in the coal district of Pennsylvania. Troops were sent to that part of the state, but Hancock became concerned because the political infighting between the President and Congress had prevented the soldiers from getting paid. Winfield ordered his troops to be encamped at a reasonable distance from the strikers to prevent them from joining forces against the corporations or the government under a common cause. The troops stayed at their posts until October 30th and were finally recalled. Hancock did not like the idea of using the army in disputes between labor and corporations. He felt that that was a wrong way to use the army, and stated as much when he wrote to the adjutant general that the regular army should not be made a police force for the state. Despite his own distaste for the job he was doing, both politicians and citizens respected Hancock for performing his duties and making sure his soldiers did not act like the militia who caused more disturbances in the strikes. The general's biographer said it best when he wrote that to emerge from such turmoil as the guardian of public order clearly established Hancock as one of the most beloved of America's military leaders. Within his new position, Winfield Scott Hancock applied himself to military theory and attempted to revitalize the United States Army. The hulking forces of the Civil War had given way to a poor excuse for an army. Hancock set about doing a few things within his power to improve the armed forces. As one of Hancock's biographers stated, the common soldiers who made up the bulk of the force were volunteers, many foreign-born, many illiterate, who signed up for a hitch of 5 years. A new recruit received little training before being sent off to a unit. A large proportion of the Army's strength was on the frontier. The soldier on the plains spent his day escorting and protecting surveying parties, railroad workers, or traders, building structures for his post, occasionally fighting, and more often chasing Indians and combating idleness with cards and alcohol. Poor rations, inadequate housing, and bad treatment by officers compounded the unpleasant conditions, and desertion was common. For one, he supported the regimented practice of rifle instruction. Soldiers were poorly trained to use their weapons, and because there was little opportunity to actually use their rifles, the soldiers exhibited substandard marksmanship. Therefore, Hancock implemented rigorous rifle instruction and training. He even oversaw the instructions at his headquarters in New York. Eventually, he would become president of the National Rifle Association, which was having trouble obtaining members at this time. His prestige helped him keep it afloat. He took that position because he truly believed in the efficiency of knowing how to properly shoot a rifle. 2. He supported the establishment of military schools and training centers. He personally helped establish the Military Service Institution of the United States in September 1878. It was modeled after the British United Service Institution to focus on military science for aspiring officers. Furthermore, his foray into military theory led him to battle it out politically with Emory Upton, another Civil War general. Upton was a West Point graduate of 1861 and had won many accolades during the conflict. He put together the idea of a skeleton army, which was not unlike John C. Calhoun's idea for the Army in 1820. Although Congress and the American people would not put up with having a large standing army, Upton wanted the Army to possess the framework of a large organization, so if a conflict did break out, then the influx of recruits would fill in the gaps and flesh out the skeleton. Hancock had a different plan. He wanted the current Army to be staffed at full strength, with each company having 100 men as designated. But to prevent Congress and the people from balking at that thought, only 8 companies would be in each regiment. Also, he wanted the Army to have less of a presence in the west along the frontier and more of a presence in the east along the coast building fortifications. That way, if war did break out, the country would have a readied force for combat and defenses capable of holding off an invasion. Hancock's plan would not increase the army size that much. It had been reduced to about 25,000 from the 50,000 right after the Civil War ended. The plan would simply fill out the army with able-bodied recruits, properly trained and educated. Senator Ambrose Burnside oversaw the committee which heard both Upton and Hancock's arguments, but the bill died in Congress. However, the country did, by default, adopt a similar theory to Upton's skeleton army plan. In 1880, Rutherford B. Hayes' presidency was coming to an end. Hayes admitted that he only wanted to serve one term, so both Republicans and Democrats dove into the political waters to emerge with a candidate. Many Republicans had turned their backs on Hayes, who they saw as not strong enough of a leader. He had pulled troops out of the South, ultimately ending Reconstruction, and he was lackluster when it came to civil service reform. The political arena was ready for Hancock to make his appearance as the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. He did have some opponents, namely Samuel Tilden, who had lost to Hayes in the controversial election of 1876. However, Hancock got a vital political ally in the 2 years before the convention. His name was Major Edward A. Burke. Burke was and continues to be an elusive character in history. His military rank was most likely self-bestowed. He claimed to be a Kentuckian, but most people pinned him as being from farther north. He was a master charlatan, and after arriving penniless in New Orleans in 1870, he worked as a day laborer at a stonecutter's yard, but before long he was a high executive in a small railroad. He used his power to become the political boss of Louisiana. We don't know exactly how Hancock came to know Burke, but it is suspected that he was introduced to the boss during his visits to New Orleans to visit the governor, who also used Burke's services. On a side note, Burke would be accused of stealing millions of dollars from the state treasury in 1889, but was never apprehended because he escaped to Honduras and lived a life of luxury the rest of his days. Nevertheless, Burke garnered all the political power he could in Louisiana to send off the delegates from that state to the Democratic Convention with Hancock's name as their primary choice. Burke did the same thing for Texas. One of Hancock's former fellow corps commanders, Baldy Smith, helped secure the Vermont delegation, and Winfield's other supporters obtained support from other various states. It was looking good for the general. The Democratic Convention met in Cincinnati, Ohio in June 1880 to choose a presidential candidate. Tilden basically sent in a resignation letter informing the delegates that he did not seek nomination. On the first ballot, Hancock was ahead, and by the second ballot, most delegations had given the general their votes. It was an amazing feat by Hancock's advocates. They had secured the votes needed and delivered rousing speeches that instilled a hope and faith that the savior of Gettysburg could win the presidency for the Democratic Party. It would not be easy for Hancock. He would be facing another Civil War general. The Republican convention chose James A. Garfield of Ohio, a dark horse candidate. This was shaping up to be an eventful election. Back at Governor's Island on the military base, Hancock got word of his nomination, and the place flooded with well-wishers, including reporters wanting to know Hancock's thoughts. In a very humble way, he thanked everyone, but didn't make any lavish declarations. Reporters also went to William Sherman and asked him what he thought of Hancock's nomination. The leader of the March to the Sea stated that he didn't get involved in politics, but if you will sit down and write the best thing that can be put in language about General Hancock as an officer and a gentleman, I will sign it without hesitation. His nomination sent shockwaves through the Republican Party, who played it off as insignificant in the papers, but behind closed doors realized the gravity of the situation. President Hayes sent word to Garfield that the Democrats had made the best decision they could have made. Another Republican regretted that now the Southern issue and the bloody shirt would have to be put away in lieu of Hancock's nomination. Within his own party, his nomination was celebrated, but some didn't know whether he could pull off a victory. However, one of his former enemies in the Confederacy, but now a Democratic congressman, Joseph E. Johnston, wired Hancock and said, "Your nomination makes me much gladder than you." Throughout the rest of the year, Hancock welcomed guests in his headquarters, but one of the guests he most enjoyed was his old Mexican war buddy Harry Heath. They talked of politics, and before leaving, Hancock told Heath, "I have made it a rule by which I shall be governed to make no promises." Hancock told of a general in his old corps who wanted to be an ambassador. "I will not do it, for I do not think he would fill credibly the position he asks, and I am determined to appoint no man to office that I do not believe qualified to fill it. I have told you that I have intended to look out for you, and I shall do so." Heath relayed to his friend that he sought no appointment, but he did seek another promise. "The promise I wish you to make me is something personal to yourself. When you become President of the United States, you will have a great deal of entertaining to do. You will have to entertain crowned heads possibly, the justices of the Supreme Court, senators, and distinguished people. I want you to promise me at these functions not to mash your potatoes." Hancock roared back, "To the devil with you and your potatoes." On July 13, 1880, heads of the Democratic Party went to Governor's Island to perform the notification ceremony for Hancock's nomination. The general was distracted to say the least. His son Russell had been visiting for over a month from Mississippi, but Russell's son, Hancock's grandson, named after the general, after a long bout with an illness since being in New York, passed away at 6 o'clock that morning. There was little time for mourning. Hancock was still the commander of the military division of the Atlantic, and now a presidential candidate. There were not enough hours in the day to take care of all matters, and he did not want to ask for leave to run his campaign, so he limited political visits to 3 hours, 3 days a week, which irritated many potential visitors. One of his old comrades in blue went to visit him during one of these visitation hours. Finding him surrounded by people, he asked, "General, how do you find this thing?" Hancock replied, "Don't find it at all. There is nothing congenial about this thing. These miserable devils worry me to death. They come here from all parts of the country, even from Arkansas and Texas, to tell me how many votes they can command. Worst of all, they want to expect pledges that I will give them offices for their services. Did you ever see such a hungry crowd? Hungry, hungry, hungry." He sighed and said it was worse than Gettysburg. "They take me in front and rear, they outflank me, and worst of all, they cut off my retreat. The locusts of old are as nothing to them." Although Republican newspapers skirted the issue of his military career, some did attack him, but the attacks fell short because most people knew his record and wouldn't believe the false reports. What they did assault him with was his lack of a political career. Inexperience was what newspapers threw at the general as insults, but the only statement that hurt him was one from his former commander, Ulysses S. Grant. In a private discussion, Reverend Fowler recorded what Grant had to say about Hancock. The former president called him ambitious, vain, and weak, and ever since his name had been put up for nomination in the past, that he had been consumed with the thought of being president. Grant even claimed that Hancock had allowed Louisiana politicians to steal $7 million from the state by appointing corrupt officers. When the story was published, Grant regretted the statements because he thought the conversation was private and wouldn't go public. The accusations about Louisiana had been false and retracted by newspapers, but the damage had been done. The subject of Mary Surratt's execution came back to haunt Hancock, but not for long. People were horrified about what happened to her, feeling her punishment unjust. But when her lawyer came out publicly and settled the matter by saying Hancock did all he could to spare the woman's life, the matter was settled. Other statements were run by Democratic newspapers, like the glowing comments by Sherman and even Sheridan, were quoted about Hancock. He said, "I am not in politics, but General Hancock is a great and good man." Democrats hurled attacks at Garfield for the financial and political scandals he had been involved in as a congressman, but ultimately neither man was completely sunk by these insults or critiques. Hancock was a war hero, and Garfield had been a loyal Union general and a congressman who had made friends in Washington, D.C. It was seemingly evenly matched in many regards. As the election neared, 3 significant moments hurt Hancock's political aspirations. First, Hancock granted an interview with a reporter who he knew would ask about one of the most contested issues of the election, the tariff. Republicans had supported a protective tariff to protect American businesses and goods from being undercut by foreign products. Democratic candidates were against tariffs in some localities and for it in others. As a party platform, they were for the reduction but not complete abolishment of tariffs. Republicans claimed that the Democrats wanted free trade, which would hurt Americans, so the Democrats needed to defend themselves against this critique. Hancock granted the interview to put that issue to rest. In the discussion, he was vague, but basically said that he would support a tariff to protect the American people. However, he described the tariffs as a local question. To 19th century Americans, this lack of political vocabulary signaled that Hancock was not a politician, and Republicans used this description of tariffs to convince Americans that Hancock was unfit for the job of president. Although not schooled in political rhetoric, Hancock knew what he meant by the term local question. He meant that the tariffs was a geographically dependent question for voters to consider when electing congressmen and senators, but that is not how many took it. Although not Hancock's actions, the mayoral race in New York City became a bone of contention when Democrats put up a Catholic as a mayoral candidate. That very act scared New Yorkers into thinking that the Democratic Party would allow the Pope to run the United States and that state funds would go to support Catholic churches and schools. Thirdly, and possibly one of the most detrimental actions, was the publishing of a letter that was allegedly from the desk of James A. Garfield, Hancock's opponent, to a labor union, which basically stated that he supported the importation of Chinese laborers to work on farms and in factories in the United States. The letter was a complete hoax, and even the labor union which it was addressed to was fictitious. The Democratic Party had supported its publishing, known as the Maury Letter. The portrayal of the party as intentionally deceitful, despite Hancock and many of the Democratic politicians having nothing to do with it, hurt the campaign significantly. On November 2, 1880, the election was underway. The South went solidly for Hancock, as expected, but now he needed to secure some Midwestern states and New York. He secured New Jersey, and he still had a lead in New York when at 9:30 p.m. Hancock stood up at his headquarters and said, "The results so far are very encouraging, and I hope they will continue to be so, but I am willing to wait till morning, and meantime get a good night's sleep. I don't care to see any further dispatches or be waked." He then went to bed. During the night, he lost New York, the state he needed to win in order to obtain the presidency. Garfield stayed up late and knew the decision by 3 a.m. Hancock woke up at 5 a.m. and asked Elmira what the news was. She said, "It has been a complete Waterloo for you." Hancock stated, "That is all right, I can stand it," then rolled over and went back to sleep. He had lost his home state of Pennsylvania and his home county of Montgomery by 1 vote. The electoral vote count stood 214 for Garfield and 155 for Hancock, 185 to win. The 35 electoral votes in New York could have swung the balance the other way for Hancock and the Democrats. There had been some missteps and bad political decisions, but he had lost, albeit with a great showing, only losing the popular vote by 7,018 votes out of more than 9 million votes cast. Although there was talk of fraud specifically in New York, Hancock stated that whether it had been taken from him by other means or if the people had voted against him, he wouldn't change the results. He had been sickened by the political aspirants and charlatans that descended upon him since the nomination, and he left any thought of political office behind him. He even attended Garfield's inauguration, stating, "I have no right to any personal feeling in the matter. It is clearly my duty as a soldier to obey." A Democratic Congress has formally announced that the people have duly elected James A. Garfield. It certainly seems that a Democratic candidate should be there to support the assertion. Thomas Nast poetically created a cartoon after the election depicting Hancock sitting next to a fire with his head bowed, while the Spirit of Liberty places her hand on his shoulder, saying, "No change is necessary, General Hancock. We are too well satisfied with your brave record as a Union soldier." Following the defeat in the presidential election of 1880, Hancock was hit with more grief in his own personal life. His chief of staff, General William G. Mitchell, who he had known and been friends with since the Battle of Williamsburg, passed away in May 1883. His mother-in-law, who lived with Elmira and Winfield, died the month before, and in December of 1884, his son Russell died at the age of 34 in Mississippi after a brief illness. Ada's death was not far from his mind either. Since she had passed, he had been very busy fulfilling her last wish, that she not be buried in the ground. So he designed a vault, and the construction was oversaw by his lawyer friend from Norristown, Pennsylvania, B.E. Chain. Hancock designed it to be big enough to lay to rest Ada and himself. Elmira wanted to be buried with her family in St. Louis, and no amount of pleading from his wife could convince him not to be buried in Norristown with Ada, the location of his boyhood. Chain not only helped him with the vault, but when Hancock needed financial help, Chain loaned him the money. Winfield always insisted on paying back the money with interest, and he never failed to make a payment to his friend. One reason that money became an issue for the general was that he had to give money to his twin brother Hilary, whose law practice in Minneapolis suffered from Hilary's alcohol addiction. In 1881, he planned the celebrations for the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Yorktown. Hancock entertained guests at a luncheon aboard the ship, the St. John, where President Chester A. Arthur was in attendance. In 1882, he, along with John M. Schofield and many other senior officers, supported a measure to be sent before Congress that would fix the retirement age for Army officers. It was an unselfish sacrifice to know that by supporting this measure, that he would most likely not obtain command of the whole army. Hancock's last major public appearance was in 1885, when he organized and coordinated the funeral procession and ceremony for Ulysses S. Grant. On August 8th, he sat astride a large black horse and led the funeral procession for the former president and army commander to the tomb, followed by numerous politicians and former commanders, both North and South. In November of that same year, Hancock traveled to Gettysburg for the first time in 20 years, where he walked over the battlefield answering questions and setting the record straight about troop placement and facts about the battle. He generally had a wonderful time reliving one of his greatest triumphs. Just a few months later, in January 1886, he traveled to Washington, D.C. for business, but he was aggravated by a boil that had popped up on the back of his neck. A doctor had lanced it, but it was growing in size and causing the general great discomfort. He left for Governor's Island earlier than planned. When he got home, his personal physician came to look at the boil and help Hancock back on his feet. His condition grew worse as the boil grew larger, causing him to not be able to move his head without great pain. Over the next few days, he would appear to be getting better, only to have a setback the next day. On the morning of February 9th, another doctor was called in after the general became so weak that he could barely speak, and an examination of his urine concluded that he was suffering from diabetes, which was exacerbating his problems. At 2:55 p.m., Hancock drew a long breath. His body quivered slightly, and then he lay still. The savior of Gettysburg was dead. Elmira was left with very little. The homes they had lived in were military quarters, so when her husband passed, she was left without much in this world. Political allies and others rallied to her support by raising around $55,000 and procuring her a house in Washington, D.C. She would pass away in 1893. Monuments were erected all over the country honoring the great general. His reputation as a superb soldier endeared him to all Americans, and he would go down as one of the country's best military leaders. Former President Rutherford B. Hayes, despite being on the opposite end of the political spectrum, wrote the following a few days after Hancock's death. If, when we make up our estimate of a public man, conspicuous both as a soldier and in civil life, we are to think first and chiefly of his manhood, his integrity, his purity, his singleness of purpose, and his unselfish devotion to duty, we can say truthfully of Hancock that he was through and through pure gold. When the statue of Hancock was unveiled at Gettysburg, Henry H. Bingham, a member of Winfield's staff, said, "One felt safe when near him."